Hi, everyone. We're moving on now to Chapter 8 for our brief recordings here that focus on a key part of each chapter. And so this one, Chapter 8, Voting and Participation, Political Participation and Voting, I believe is the overall title here for Chapter 8. And the one part that we're going to look over for this point to ponder is making voting more convenient for the participants. And does that correlate to more people voting as a result? And there's some really good descriptions of this and some good information in your text on these particular subjects. So overall, it's a very fair question, I would think, to just wonder how convenient should it be? You know, what kind of effort needs to be made on the part of the voter when it comes to participating in an election? Do you have to give some indication that this really matters to you? And we've seen some times recently in particular states where the wait time for people to show up and vote has been quite long from what most of us, I think, would expect to go vote. You know, what are we generally thinking of here? You know, 10, 15 minutes perhaps to go vote. But what if you now have to wait 3 hours to go vote, or maybe even longer in some cases? Now, it could be that you have some situations where the vote was just so much larger than anticipated that those who are responsible for the election just didn't have enough polling stations, didn't have enough polling workers, perhaps didn't have enough ballots. So there could be all kinds of issues there. I mean, there's an anticipation on what the turnout might be. And if that turnout becomes so much higher than what was anticipated, then it may appear that the state is quite behind. Now, maybe there's other motives behind making it difficult to vote, and I think it's something that we all have to consider as we read through this chapter and think about this whole process of making it convenient to vote. But for example, just a week ago, you had an election in Georgia, and it's reported on a really good site. If you want to get more information about government and politics, you can check out the site, The Hill, and does point out that just in the two parties, those voting in the Democratic primary, there were 4 times as many votes cast as had been cast just 4 years earlier in 2016. So that's part of my point that I wanted to bring out, that it could be that those who are responsible for the election are basing their level of preparation on the most recent election, and that may not be adequate. And so I'm assuming that people, at least some of the administrators in Georgia, were thinking, this is the type of turnout we had 4 years ago. We'll have a similar turnout this time. Didn't work out that way. So can there be other ways of trying to make it more convenient to get people to vote, to help people go and cast their ballots? Page 327 is just a valuable page in your text to give you some good information about voting and registration reforms. Again, with the intent, making it more convenient for people to be able to cast a ballot. And then, as a result of it being more convenient, more people will cast ballots. So you have the permanent absentee ballot mail-in. There are many states that have a variation of that, Oklahoma being one of them, but there are only 5 states in which the ballots are mailed to the voters. Now, the other states, again, Oklahoma being one of them, you have 27 states in the District of Columbia voters can request an absentee ballot, but and also with that, there's no excuse. You don't have to give an explanation why you need a mail-in ballot. So you just simply want to mail in your ballot. You don't want to show up at the voting precinct. And so that certainly is convenient. What is somewhat inconvenient for the state of Oklahoma, especially when you consider COVID-19, and that was not brought out in your text, but if this is part of the reason why people may want to vote in a different way, instead of the face-to-face voting, to use a mail-in ballot, if you then have to require that your ballot is notarized, then that reduces some of that purpose. It reduces the motivation. So you would still have to find some way to go to a bank or insurance office, wherever there may be a notary, to get your ballot notarized, your mail-in ballot. So we can see there are 3 states require that, Oklahoma being one of them. And then you have early voting. Oklahoma is one of the states for that as well. And you can see here that in some cases it's up to 40 days before an election a person can cast a ballot. So that's a case of really making a preparation here in advance to do that. So that's a convenience as well. And then you have same-day registration. And same-day registration clearly is one of the cases, as your text points out, that does in fact increase the overall voting turnout by roughly 5%. In other words, you can tag on an increase of 5% in an election simply because you did have the same-day registration. As your text also mentions, there is a concern here that if you went that route, you perhaps are increasing the possibility of fraud, increasing the possibility of a non-citizen voting, because it's just more people voting, and there's also other paperwork coming in, the registration, which is taking place at the same time as the election. And so that may then just heighten the possibility of something being misplaced, overlooked, and fraud being able to enter in. Okay, maybe that is partly the situation, but as you can see here, you do have 17 states that go that route, along with the District of Columbia. Is it not that surprising that you may have people that have not really prepared for an election where perhaps they should, and then they start to think, well, yeah, I would like to vote, but they had missed the registration deadline in some other state. But if you had same-day registration the day of the election, you can also register and you can go vote. Does it matter? There's some excellent maps that you can go online and check out if you'd like to do some more research about this, or just kind of do your own investigation. And we tend to see, not too surprising, states that make it more convenient tend to have a higher voter turnout. And just to give you some idea, which it doesn't necessarily that strongly correlate here, but if you look at the 5 states that had the permanent mail-in ballot, all from the West, and you had Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Hawaii. So if you look that over and you look at this map, you can see here that Washington, Oregon, and Colorado have a high voter turnout compared to other states. It's not so much the case with Utah, and certainly not with Hawaii, not in this this map. And so on that issue, it doesn't seem to make that much of a difference there in Hawaii. But we can see that there's quite a variety of voter turnout among the states, and then there's different laws and restrictions for voter turnout. So some states have a higher voter turnout than others, and it does seem to make connections on how easy it may be or how convenient it may be to go vote. So notice there with Minnesota having a very high turnout, as also with Maine. So we know with Colorado about the mail-in ballot. This chart here is ranking the states. So you have the easiest to vote, and all the way down to the 50th, which is the hardest to vote. And so there you can see Oregon, the easiest to vote of any state, and does have a very high voter turnout. Notice that Minnesota had, it looked like, about the highest turnout of any state. They're close to the highest, if not the highest. And they're the 12th easiest, so they're still pretty high up there. Maine had a high turnout, and they're the 6th easiest. Colorado had a high turnout, and they're the 2nd. So it doesn't necessarily always correlate, because Utah didn't have too high of a turnout, and they were 7th when it comes to, they are 7th, as you can see here on this chart, when it comes to turnout. But generally with the correlation there, it does connect. So you make it easier to vote, and more people will turn out to vote. Make it harder to vote, to register to vote, and to go show up and vote, and fewer people will turn out to vote. So there can be a part of that motivation, and maybe that's something for you to consider when you're casting your ballot, to look at who's running for office and how they feel about this overall. Do they believe that it's worthwhile to take the risk or the possibility that there may be fraud, maybe some instances of fraud, but still the need to want more people to vote? Or are they concerned, candidates running for office, are they concerned with fraud so much that they make it more restrictive to go and vote? And clearly we can see that this issue will still be with us in the future. And many of you, of course, are quite comfortable with technology, and we see that technology is a big part of our lives. So I don't think we immediately discount voting by phone or computer or something like Zoom. And we may think that it would lead to more fraud, and possibly it would. But we know that you could have on a phone or in a computer that you have perhaps something like voice recognition, some other kind of fingerprint recognition, retina recognition, to be able to go and cast a ballot through a computer. So it could actually become even more restrictive, or at least a case in which you have a greater review of the possibility of fraud and through the technology than you would in the face-to-face ballots. So I think in many ways we look at computer voting and we think of computer hacking, and there's no doubt that that's a possibility. But it could also be based on the different firewalls that would be put in place. Perhaps you could actually have that even more restrictive, even though there would be some conveniences involved where people could just stay at home and vote at 3 in the morning if they wanted to in a particular election. So some of the possibilities in the future when it comes to voting. So there are some of the issues then to look over for the voter registration and casting a ballot, and how restrictive should it be, how convenient should it be. So that's what we'll cover there for Chapter 8. We'll be moving on to political parties in Chapter 9 the next time that we're together.